This is the Atari ST podcast.
User testing with people, like I would just get random people to sit down and go through the system and have them think aloud about, I would ask them what they thought this symbol meant or that symbol meant. You show people a trash can now and they immediately know that that's delete. But at that point, some people would say, oh, they thought it was a can for storing things for later.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Jerome Domurat worked at Atari from November 1981 through July 1986 as an artist and interface designer. He started creating art for home game systems, including E.T., Krull, Millipede, and Raiders of the Lost Ark for the Atari 2600, and Jungle Hunt, Pengo, and Baseball for the 5200. He made the transition when Jack Tramiel bought the company. He worked on user interface design for the Atari ST. He also helped design the NEOchrome paint program and adapted the graphics and animation for the ST version of Star Raiders. This interview took place on February 1st, 2016. Let's go to the beginning. Tell me how you got interested in computers. Tell me how you got hired by Atari.
Let's see. That was quite a while ago. My interest in computers started while I was working at the museum in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the American Museum of Science and Energy. And we were using computers in our exhibits. And so we were using PET Commodores to start with. And I had worked on a Hangman game that was Energy Hangman. And that was kind of, I'd always had an interest in computers, but they were always an elusive, big, huge thing that, wasn't approachable. And then when the Atari 800 came out, I actually bought one like shortly after it came out and started working on it, started becoming familiar with assembly and some code writing, but I was most interested in the graphics that it supported. And I had worked on a simple animation program with another engineer who was at the museum, and his name was Jim Dunyan. He got hired by Atari and then was probably working out here for maybe a year. And I came out to visit. I actually came out for a conference, and he's the one that said, oh, you've got to talk to Atari and you got to go see what they're doing and so on. And at that point, games they were visible and they were exciting and so on, but they were still considered to be a fad and a passing thing. And there wasn't that deep, like, this is going to change society kind of feel that, is sort of prevalent now because of the history that technology took. So I went in and I talked to Marilyn Toyer, who was Dave Toyer's wife. She ran the graphics and animation group there. And I showed, the simple stuff I'd been working on, the drawing tool, some game ideas that I was trying to create. And I had thought during the interview that, like, wow, they must be having engineers of, incredible caliber coming in here and working here and so on. And I was shocked because everybody was like, excited about what I was doing and interested and so on. And so I had an immediate connection there with the fact that the things that they were pursuing and trying to do was similar to my own interest. So anyways, Marilyn hired me and I became part of I think I was the second person to join the graphics and animation group. And my first thing that I did there was helping to color convert VCS carts from NTSC to PAL. And so I went in and did color matching between the two systems. And then Dave Toyer had worked on, he worked in CoinOp also. He worked on a program on the 800 that enabled us to um, draw on screen and then to dump the data and transfer it to the games, which was a big leap to have such a tool, because previously all the graphics on screen were done, in hex off of someone's head. You drew it on graph paper and then you figured it out and you typed the hex in. So anyhow, that's kind of my start with it, and I always had a broad interest in, where tech was going and what impact and influence it was having, on a lot of different levels. So.
Nice. So, okay, so you started off doing the color matching of PAL things, and
Yeah.
then at what point did you start doing new graphics for games?
Well, I mean, that sort of started when I got there. I mean, it was part of what I was doing. At that point, I mean, the one thing to point out about technology is there wasn't the tremendous specialization and job titles that exist today. It's like, I'm astounded by now. There's like this level of, there's somebody that animates figures and somebody that does backgrounds and somebody that writes code and somebody, there's like this vast array of people. And in those days, somebody that could pound together a game and get it working, that's that was it. And so that sort of separation or specialization started to occur um, when people wanted to tighten the schedule, because it was time consuming to both do animation and both write code. And so those jobs kind of separated out. So did audio and sound. Started to become, we started to have sound audio engineers that worked specifically on game sounds. But up until that point, there wasn't this tremendous, like, oh, this is what you do and this is what someone else does. I mean, the participation was, I sat in, and all of us did. We sat in the game meetings determining the strategy, the design, talking about possibilities, coding, how the thing worked, the limitations of the technology played a big role in what you could accomplish and do. And so, but going back to your question about when did I start in the animation part? Part of it is my major in school was in video and animation, and so I had already sort of had an animator's background in the sense of, like, I sort of had the traditional film cell training in animation and drawing, and so I had a lot of I did a lot of sketching and drawing for all the games. I did storyboards and um, what would be considered concept ideas for how something might look or appear. Um, and what's funny is those were generally a high resolution, detailed, uh, drawing that, when you translated it to a screen, it was 8 pixels wide and 12 pixels tall. So it
Lost something
was,
in the translation.
yeah. So, and one of the stories to that is that I did the storyboards for ET, or for Raiders the Lost Ark game,
Mm-hmm.
and my friend and programmer Howard Warshaw, he looked at the storyboards and he was taking them to Spielberg to show him, to do a walk through the game, and his feeling is like, oh, these are way too complex and beyond what we can deliver and so on. And my thinking is this is Steven Spielberg. He's going to think these storyboards are just too simplistic and too
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so there was kind of that intensity between the limitations of that early technology and what we were used to as animation and film, and the resolution and detail. So which is kind of gone away in some sense now. I mean, I see a lot of games now that, wow, the realism in them is beyond what you would even sketch out. So um, uh,
So, um,
yeah.
let's talk about the 5200 because that's near and dear to
Okay.
my heart.
Okay.
I think you worked on graphics for Jungle Hunt and Pengo and baseball,
Correct. Yeah.
right?
Those were the three games that I worked on that were published. I did a lot of work on other 5200 games that never. There was always half starts and things that almost got there and stuff that we do part way.
Well, this is
So,
relevant to my interest. Tell me,
mm,
what can you remember about any games that were started and not completed?
oh, wow, that's a good question. I'd almost have to look through some of my early notes. Um, Gee, it's funny, the ones that you work on that don't ship, you know, you don't keep in mind. Um, some of the things were experimental, like, gosh, I know that there was, there was a lot of discussion about different game concepts, and then, we would take it so far, and then then there'd be the sense of, well, is this really a game or not? With the 5200, it was basically the 800 sort of computer that Atari had dumbed down as a game machine,
Right.
and because of that, it sort of had the same limitations that the 800 had, but it had increased graphic capability compared to the VCS, which is what I had been working on. Um, And I mean, the one thing that I worked on the 5200 that I was really interested in was you could stamp graphics. So if you did a little 8 by 8 square, you could repeat that 8 by 8 square anywhere on screen and it would save real estate. So games like in Jungle Hunt, the forest part that's scrolling on top and the bottom scrolling areas, those are all stamped out little maps of connecting these tiled pieces of graphics, and that was such a visual challenge. I mean, it was so hard to use the least number of stamps and make it look the richest in its drawing, and so there were a lot of tricks like that we were trying to play with the limitations and trying to make it look to give it more graphic depth. And then trying to think. Well, Pengo was just a direct coin op, copy, and so essentially we just studied the game to the nth degree and played the coin op, and then I sort of remanufactured the look and feel of it on screen. So. And I would say with the 5200, there was definitely more of a need to have a programmer focused on the code and someone focused on what was going to appear on screen, because what appeared on screen got more complex. So, um, and one thing to add to that about sort of the job and titles and what people work on is that I would say the entire time of those early years of Atari, everyone was trying to come up with their job description or job title. So there were a gazillion job titles, and eventually people reverted to just strange things on their business card of master chef, or um, just I'm trying to think of some of the titles that people had, but it was very, like, I think my title was something like games animator engineer. It was just a string of words.
Right.
So um, so anyhow, that's and the 5200 unfortunately also came along just before the collapse of Atari Games and the Time Warner owning of the company, and um, so there was a lot of things in development. There was like a speedboat game, and there was there was a hockey game that was sort of discussed and going on, um, and some of those never saw the light of day because of you know Atari basically shut down and sold to Jack Tramiel and became a whole different company at that point.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd have to look through. I do have my early engineering notebooks and things because when I ended up working for Tramiel's Atari, and at that period, I said to him, I have all this game development stuff and so on, and it's, you know, shouldn't it be? Is it confidential to the company and so on? And they sort of expressed like, yeah, we don't care about that stuff. We're gonna, it's not what we're doing. So I was able to keep a lot of my early notes and development sketches and
Wow.
drawings and
Have you
things. Which
scanned that stuff and shared it? I mean, I saw some
I,
online where I think you put the Raiders stuff was in some magazine, and but I mean, have you just
yeah,
scanned it all and made it all available for historians?
no, because there's just such a bulk of it, and I have scanned parts of it. I did. For different films and other magazine articles when somebody's been focused on something like the Raiders. Yeah, there was a British magazine that was interested in that. So some of those things I've captured, but I would say there's a chunk of it that hasn't been scanned. And so anyways,
All
but
right. Well, I'm putting it out there that
so
if you I would like to see that stuff scanned, and if I will happily borrow that stuff from you, scan every page of it, and get it all back to you, and then it'll be nice high-res scans that hopefully we could share with the world, and that would be an awesome little bit of Atari history that to share with the world, get out there.
yeah, and I've been trying to that the difficult part is it's sort of scattered in my house. I have bits and pieces of things in different places and so on. So at some point, I've been trying to get it more concentrated, but some of the stuff has been is available and published through other things. There were magazine articles or um, and then some of the stuff is news clippings and things that I have that just pertain to the industry at the time. But yeah, I've been trying to think about how to get that work. And what's tough about it is I had lent several pieces out for somebody that wanted to scan, and I never got them back. And so I'm a little bit shy on like just shipping it somewhere. Because it's a lot of it's one of a kind stuff. It
Yeah, I
doesn't.
bet.
It's like my copy is the only copy, and a lot of it's different sizes. I mean, we were working on. I have some stuff that's artwork that's like 2 by 3 feet and larger, and then some of it's 8.5 by 11, and some of it's you know um, there's different sizes to it. But yeah, the thing I would like to get scanned, which I have been working on, I have scanned partially, is some of my engineering notebooks, because most of those have a lot of the notes on conceptual things that were being discussed. Um, and the other thing to add to that is that there was a lot of stuff kicked around, and it wasn't like, oh, this is the project and here's the game. Like some projects like Pengo had a clear, like, we want to copy the coin up version of this and do a home version. And that had a very limited thing. But other concepts were like, what would be an interesting way to animate? Could we do something that animates water or does, sort of rendering techniques, and then trying to figure out what the gameplay would be there. Um, and I will say my main interest game wise has always been I really like adventure sort of puzzle solving games, and so most of the things that I tried to do had that sense of um, here's this thing. How do you find out about it? How do you travel in this world? And so for a lot of that generated a lot of pages of drawings and stuff of, here could be an adventure game in this world or that world, or, that type of thing.
Thank you. You made the transition into when the Tramiels bought the place. I mean, I've talked to so many people who were either laid off when they came in or quit just before, but you made the transition and you stuck around and worked on ST stuff. So tell me about that change.
Well, I mean, one of the things to say about it that was kind of interesting is at that point, I really wanted to work on a color computer home system. And, Apple had the Mac, but it was black and white. And I really wanted to see something, 68,000 processors were now being used. And so I wanted to do something in color. And when I talked to, when they were doing the interviewing process of being laid off or not, I talked to Leonard, what was Jack's son, and I said to him, I'm really interested in working on a color-based home system, blah, 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 that does this and that. And so anyways, they kept me around because in a sense I described what the ST was. And I think, Leonard later mentioned to me that part of his interest, he was surprised that I knew what they were doing, even though I didn't know what they were doing. I mean, I was just I was looking for the job I wanted to do. And so it turned out that worked out to be what they were producing. So, and the ST, well, the company changed tremendously. There were huge swaths of empty buildings and people gone, and everything came down to a smaller core of people working together. And so my main involvement with the ST was all the visual appearance stuff that appeared on screen. So all the icons, typefaces. At that point, there wasn't, any kind of true type. It was all bitmap type. So I did the initial font sets and the, everything from the cursors and pointers to, the icons, and working on the behavior of, how those things would interact. I mean, a lot of it was sort of mimicking what was current, desktop thinking with, what the Star had presented and what the Mac had. And, there were a number of visual systems out there. I can't think of them right now, but I remember looking at all those different things and comparing them and trying to decide, what we could do that would be either different or unique and give it some style. So, and then the other challenge is that the ST had different resolution modes, and so you could switch between that. And so I was trying to make the graphics all scalable to whatever mode they were in. And that's when I discovered that there was a magic angle that if you took a graphic and turned it at an angle, when it scaled, it tended to look the same and retain its shape. So, but I was involved in those early, like the ST machine before it's sort of coming into the world kind of thing. And I guess we were, I'm trying to think, DRI had done the GEM operating system, and we were sort of taking that and trying to punch it up and fix it some, because it visually wasn't, it was rather crude. So, but let's see, what other questions do you have there on the ST?
More on the ST. The looking at your LinkedIn, it said you created the boot screen and system icons and cursors and the 250K of color graphics and animation for that's for Star Raiders, I think. You did Star Raiders on the ST as well.
Yeah. There were several projects that we did. One of the first projects we did was Dave Stogis was the engineer for. We did a paint drawing program called NEOchrome,
Mm-hmm.
and part of what he was doing was he was writing that as a tool that I could use to draw these other things and to work on the screen stuff directly on screen, because there were no color drawing programs at that point. I mean, there was like Mech Paint, but that was a black and white thing. And so in using NEOchrome, it also had sort of an animation component built into it. And so the one game that we decided to do was Star Raiders, and that was to test out drawing, the drawing program at the same time producing a game. And so that was an interesting leverage, because as we would work on certain game details, we would realize, like, oh, the drawing program has to do this, and it'd be nice to be able to lasso just a certain color and move it or change it. And so a lot of those early color um, tools and manipulations, we were starting to work on. And yeah, boy, I forgot about. There was a lot of work done on that, and let's see.
Tell me a little about Star Raiders, the port.
Well, Star Raiders, Doug Neubauer did the original Star Raiders on the Atari 800, and I have to say that was the game that sucked me into the 800. I saw that game and I thought, wow, that is just a brilliant game. I mean, it had both levels of play action and sort of a chess strategy of, you had to constantly pay attention to the map and, determine, if your bases were being surrounded and how to keep that from happening. And so it was kind of fun to work on that game, because I got to really analyze the original game. And then mostly what we did was try to just dress up the feeling of what things were and how the map worked. And now that we had more color and more resolution, we had a bit of animation. But it was kind of frustrating because we still couldn't animate. Like, if we started to get too large of a scale of an object and tried to move it, it became jerky. So that, we did that thing of putting the screen such that all the action takes place in a very small area. And the objects aren't as large as they should have been to make a cool effect, but I think a lot of that worked. And there was a lot of animation in that game that that you really don't see if you don't play the entire game. There were things that we put in several different little Easter egg things that would happen if you did certain things in the game. But fundamentally, that game was the intention was to not try to invent or design a new game, but to see how fast we could implement, an existing game into a more complex world, and graphically. So that, I think we worked on that for about 3 months, and that was it. And it was fairly quickly done. I mean, we didn't spend any time discussing how we would change or adapt the game or expand it, or essentially we wanted to stay true to that initial game. So but there was a lot of stuff in that original game. I mean, that was a really nicely designed. I mean, to me, that was one of the early masterpieces of video gaming, just because it created its own genre almost. I mean, and there's very little that ever came in that imitated that, that had that same combination of chess strategy, defending the universe and jumping into hyperspace between things, and then having an action, fighting, shooting, firing at the other spaceships. So, yeah, and all all of that game was done in the NEOchrome paint program, which got released. I mean, that was another released program from that period. So
do you think, what was the sense from your team about the ST? I mean, were they excited by it? Do they think it was, were they happy with it and with the interface and just with,
I think there was tremendous excitement about it, but there was also a sense of like, well, how is this really pushing the envelope further? And there was also the thing of deadlines. We wanted to get it to market as quickly as possible, and so the hardware was being built and designed at the same time we were doing the software. And I do remember it was really frustrating because I was developing things on, the 800 or on paper. I did some of the work on the Mac, even of just drawing out things, and we still didn't have a machine to run it on. It was the development of the interface started before we had hardware, and so that was tough. It's hard to work on something when you don't have the actual thing.
Sure.
But we sort of worked around that, and then when we got the machine and got things running, it was like a real mind opener, because I remember feeling like, oh wow, this is so totally different than I thought it was going to be. And so a lot of the stuff I had planned for, thought of, was either possible or not possible, and and some of the feature sets of things, there was, how the question was like, how do you address having a color world and having a desktop? Should we introduce like super colored windows and so on? And my basic instinct or approach was to keep everything at a minimum for color. I really didn't want to have 16 different colors on windows and so on. So in a certain sense, I question that now, in that in some ways I think it made the machine look like it was less performance because it was operating simply. But from the user perspective, I think if we had made everything detailed and skeuomorphic and colored and so on, I think it would have been too much. So that was always one of the questions I was struggling with, is like, is this getting too complex, or is it better to just keep it in that simple graphic kind of design mode? And it was, because I remembered at one point I did color icons that were, the trash can looked like a trash can, and so on, and they had a very 3D. I kind of made them like what app icons look like today. They were super colored and stuff, and it just seemed like too much on screen. I mean, it was, it seemed like the simple, like just having one color worked better than having this multitude of drawing on there. So, and my feeling is that the complexity needed to be in the content, in the games and in the programs, and not on the desktop, not on the basic part of the interface. So,
Nice.
And
You
go ahead.
sent me this great picture, March 1985, of you and Dave Stogis and Jim Eisenstein sitting around the office.
Yes.
You're surrounded by, looks like there's a Mac and there's a bunch of Apple Lisas. And do you remember this day, or what you guys were up to?
Yeah, actually I do, because I scanned that out of my engineering notebook where I stuck that in. And Well, I would say that Jim and Dave worked tremendously with the on-screen graphics with me, and so we were constantly discussing ideas about, you know, how things could appear, should they be animated, how they would work. Um, so it's funny. I'm looking at the page and there my one note here is I wrote about the invention of the Stogis maneuver, and it was the first time viewing of a split screen showing medium res at the bottom of the screen and low res at the top of the screen. That was one of the tricks that the ST could do, is you could change resolution mode on any horizontal line. And so I think what we were working on then was that's how NEOchrome was that the tool pattern, the tools down below were all in low res, and the screen itself was in high res, and that way we were able to put up more screen and scroll it and so on. So I also see a note here of ThunderScan, which was an early scanner.
Installed in your printer, I think.
Yes. Yeah. It requires a 128K Mac and a image writer printer. I actually used that to convert a number of drawings and things to screen, and then I would refine them on screen. So I'm trying to look at the other thing that I was working on at that point, which I think is probably about the time of that picture, was I did the original boot screen graphics of the things that came up when you launched the system, and we were discussing what should it say on screen, how do you inform people about what's going on, and it really took some clever programming to make some of those effects, because we were so limited in what would go into ROM. And so some of those things were actually in the ROM, burned into ROM with the system, and so we wouldn't be able to go back and change them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the main thing I was trying to do is put into ROM what were things that could become useful in doing other things and other screens. So I was putting things like the Atari logo and a disk drive drawing and a OK button and so on, and those were all in ROM so that you could call them and have them come out. And the other big discussion we were having at that point was kind of a fun one, was what should the weight, when the machine is busy and the computer's doing something, what should it show? And the Mac, showed a watch.
Right.
And so I felt that the watch was like, oh, here, we're showing you that you're wasting time waiting for your computer to do something. And so I wanted something a bit more, something a bit more positive to the message of the machine. So that's when I got into drawing the bee.
The Bumblebee, yeah.
So the Bumblebee, I liked the idea that it was like something fun that you could move around screen, and it just showed that the bee, like I felt B is for busy, so that the machine was busy. It was doing your work. You weren't waiting for it. And so those were some of the tweaks or things that happened, was just, like for the wait busy icon, we were thinking of putting a coffee cup, a lock. I don't even know what that was about. Station break announcer, an hourglass. I did feel that the timepiece things were, like I said, I felt like they implied this thing's so slow, you have to wait for it,
Right.
So, but Yeah, I kind of went through that with most of the icons. There weren't many that I tried to make different than the standard that had kind of already been present in a lot of desktop stuff. It's tough working on things where there's like the common vernacular of expectation of, people know what a stop sign is, and that's what they expect, and stop has a certain meaning that's like universal. Or do you come up with something sort of different than that, and will it work as well? And I tended to have sort of a practicality view of like, um, if it works and there's a known thing, use it. And one of the things that I struggled with for years, with the whole iconography of things, was coming up with a symbol for undo. you know. And I think it's interesting, undo still really doesn't have its own icon, which is kind of astounding because it's such a major part of a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the way people represent it now is with arrows.
Right,
And
the swooping left-facing arrow,
yeah,
is kind of what I think of as undo. So what did
yeah.
you consider? What kind of things did you think about?
Well, that was part of the thing. Wait, let me look at the page. I think I have some notes on that.
This book sounds wonderful, and we have to get it scanned, I gotta say.
Yeah, I mean, it's got some interesting things pasted into it. It's though I can definitely see where there were days that I was much more busy than others. Let's see. Well, one of the funny things that I felt with iconography in general and trying to put symbols up on screen was that I realized that an arrow could solve any problem. So I used to have this joke of like, if you don't know what to put up there as a symbol, put an arrow. And I'm beginning to see, and it kind of cracks me up now that if you look at the the current iOS and stuff, it's like there's like 16 different forms of an arrow on one screen now. I mean, everything has turned into, there's an arrow for up, back, forward, undo, redo. It sort of did become the the de facto. So
maybe a little lazy, but the lazy de facto.
Yeah, I don't know if it's laziness as much as it's a tough communication issue to, like undo doesn't have any kind of metaphor or symbol in the world, But I do think that there was the opportunity probably earlier on to establish, more universal icons. And so, and I'm sorry, I'm flipping through to try to find I thought I had a page in here where I put all my undo ideas. But eventually I decided that the word itself, just done as letters with the UN on top and DO on bottom, I think that's what we ended up using. Just the word itself seemed to work the best. And I did have a lot of little, like I was trying to do a bunch of things with hands, because there was the little pointer with the hand, and scroll was done as a hand thing in a lot of the early systems. And so I was trying to do different hand gestures, a thumbs up, a pointing to something, a hand, erasing something. That was my undo thing was, could you have a little hand with an eraser, sort of like implying, erase back. And a lot of the undo concepts, I was trying to go for that direction of, erasing back to where you were, which, and then we got into the whole thing of how far back does undo? That was always a tough question, and I think it still is. I think computers have not really solved that issue. But I felt that it was important that undo, no matter how far it went back, there should be a redo, that you should be able to toggle between the two. That, and that was something that, we were working at. Oh, here's I found the page with the search for undo. One of them was a footprint that was implying stepping backwards, rear view mirror, a genie magic lamp, an hourglass where the sand was going in the opposite direction where it was going up. That's where I started getting into time machine things, and also turning back a page, which is almost too much of a writing reference, and also just putting a toggle switch that was like put a switch to toggle. That was some of those concepts.
Super interesting.
So yeah, it was. Yeah, and I think at a point I did. The rear view mirror became sort of a. We were trying to make that work, but it was tough to draw it in such a small number of pixels and have it come across that people could read it. And that's when I decided to just go for the text. Just put undo as text. It was. I also had a submarine and a coin with heads and tails, and a subtraction minus sign. And what's interesting is I actually did draw the curved arrow, which is sort of the one that's used now. I did have that in my notes as like, oh, you could just have this arrow circling back on itself. So searching for those kinds of details and concepts, and then part of it is we were also doing just sort of user testing with people. Like I would just get random people to sit down and go through the system and have them think aloud about. I would ask them what they thought this symbol meant or that symbol meant, and so I did quite a bit of polling on different people, and it was kind of interesting because at that point the audience for computing wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. You show people a trash can now and they immediately know that that's delete. But at that point it was sort of like I would ask people about that, and some people would say, oh, they thought it was a can for storing things for later, that it was there was like this mix of interpretation for it. So
wow.
Yeah. And one other historic comment I have to make that is kind of in looking through my notes here is that a lot of the stuff that I did initially, since I didn't have a color machine to work on, I was drawing stuff on the Macintosh, and one of the engineers was friends with Andy Hertzfeld, and so we talked to him and we figured out how to do a convert pin cable that would enable me to export what I had drawn on the Mac to the ST. And so that saved me a lot of redrawing onto the system because I could do it on the Mac and then send it over to the ST and start to look at it. And that was a kind of an interesting way of development. So just because we didn't have any tools or paint programs or anything to draw or work with, so I was constantly searching for what's the fastest way I can get it up on screen. and what sort of process can I use, and could I draw it on some other earlier machine and port it over, and so some of the stuff I know drawing wise, like when we put the pointers in, I think I just typed in the hex code. I converted it to what it would be in code and just wrote that out, um, so so yeah, there weren't the development tools that exist now in technology for developing something. There was no Photoshop. There was no way to create, um, images for the screen except to either do it, brute force it with typing the hex, or figure out a way to move it from something.
Mm-hmm.
And I did use the Thunder Scan actually to scan a bunch of things and then move those over early on. And so I would do a rough sketch, scan it, send it over, and then clean it up once I had it on the system. So, anyhow, and what?
So after that work was done and the ST was out and you had done the GUI and all that, then what did you do?
You mean? Well, I went to Apple actually.
No, I mean before you left Atari. I mean,
before I left,
you were after the ST was out. How did you keep yourself busy before at Atari before your time there ended?
Well, I mean, we were working on the Paint program, and that had gone out, and we were doing a revision of that. And sort of towards the end there, I think that's when Star Raiders was done. And part of why I left was that it felt like there wasn't anything further to develop or do there, and there wasn't a big push to like reinvent it or to do like the next release of it. There was this sense of like, okay, well, it's done and it's out there. It should just stay the way it is. So yeah, those early OSs, there wasn't the thought that like you would improve them and re-release them and make little changes and send them out again. And I mean, that was considered like, at that point, it was considered like, why would you do that? And I think it's interesting that, that later on that became the de facto mode for, you did 1.0 and then 2.0 and then 3.0. And that a lot of operating systems evolved. But I think at that point it was considered like once it's done, and, there's no changing it or going back. And I think there was also a public perception thing of like, did people want to relearn something that they barely knew to begin with? It took a lot of, like I said, for people to come to accept what the trash can meant and what the disc icon meant and what the arrow meant, and so it was kind of like. In the early days of that interaction, it was considered like, well, it would be disruptive to move things or change things or recolor them, or, so in a certain sense, I guess I'm saying I think it wasn't so much like, what was the future thing to do, but sort of like, well, the work had been done. It was shipped and completed. So we did make some changes and updates, but very few. I mean, and most of them were the result of some sort of bug that had to be fixed. And so, there had to be either a workaround or a replacement or, something along those lines. So, yeah, anyhow, and the ST to me was an interesting machine because I feel like it didn't find its audience fast enough. And I feel like it sort of went unrecognized. I mean, when I look at the development of computers and what a lot of people publish, I feel like they overlooked the ST, and it was way ahead of a lot of machines. The Color Mac still hadn't come out, and it was there. And I think a big part of that was the whole development relationship to the community. I know the ST did better in Europe because there was a stronger fan base for it and development. And I think Tramiel was sort of hoping that he could do the same thing he had done with the Commodore of, just put it out there and people will find a way to use it and they'll do things. But the problem is that the increased complexity, I think, of the machine made it less accessible to people that just wanted to do something quick. There was a steeper learning curve. There was much more that you had to think about. There was color. There was, a whole bunch of other factors. So, but, and there was also the attitude of trying not to position it so much as a game machine, which I think it would have been a great game machine at that point. The other thing to say is, the Amiga was sort of around and up and developing at the same time. And so there was a lot of competition between the Amiga and the ST about, what had better graphics and who could do what. And, and there were different little demos that were done. There was like a rotating bouncing ball that had checks on it. And there was a thing of comparing which machine could do that better. And I feel like even the Amiga was sort of overlooked in terms of the early days of technology as a machine, because it did some stuff brilliantly. And I've always felt that it had just a slight edge on perhaps some of the ST stuff. It just seemed to have a cleaner display, and the audio on it was, a much better chip in terms of, what sounds people could create. That was another part of the desktop thing in the early days, is like I spent a good amount of time thinking about what the sounds would be for the interaction. And I think what's interesting about desktops is they became totally silent because of the Office use. Like you didn't want clicks and buzzes and whistles for every time you closed a window to have a swoop sound, and to have things pop up and ring, and and I think I was always a little bit disappointed in the way audio was always, it sort of became neglected, and I think it still is within computing, that it doesn't give you any user feedback like that something worked. And there's basically the click and the doink sound now,
Right.
that if you do something and it doesn't work, it doinks, and if you click something, it'll click. But we were trying to look at, making this whole audio environment out of the system. And so a lot of that sort of ended up not being in there. And I have to admit that even it was an irritation thing after a while. I mean, it's kind of like it's a fun thing when you first start, but then to have to hear a sound repeated a bunch of times if you're doing something just becomes too much. So,
can you give examples of what kind of sounds you considered? I mean, I can think of, there was clicking noises maybe, and what things were left on the cutting room floor?
Oh, there was a number of sounds that we were trying to get for swooshing the window in and out. Like when you brought up a file window, like should there be a sound that it swishes up and swishes down, and also having bells and buzzer things that, like, that certain things clicked would give a ring sound as opposed to just a click sound. And then a lot of them, I was just trying to work with like simple, what I considered game noises that like, because we had, in games there had always been all that doink, click, buzz, swish type sound. And so it's funny, those sounds are like, they're hard to describe. But when you hear them, they're just these short little, things. And Um, but I mean, we were considering things like the sound of breaking glass for something that, failed, and different buzzers and different sort of alarms, a siren sound for something that needed attention and so on. So, but the other thing I have to say to that is that because all those audio sounds were similar to how games behaved, I think there was the view that, like, if you put those in the operating system, it becomes too game-like. It becomes too much of a fun thing because it has this audio reward thing. And I think people associated that with video games. And so that sort of removed it from the, oh no, this is a serious business computer that can do Excel and Word, spreadsheets and so on. So, um, but but I don't know. I think that could show up again in some operating system. I mean, there's hints of it and things, and um, it's been interesting to me to see how people have used ringtones on their phone. Phones have become much more audio. You can pick sounds for, a particular person calling, for messages, for all sorts of stuff. So, um, but
How did your time at
yeah,
Atari come to an end?
Um, actually, I found out through a bunch of connections that there was stuff going on at Apple that I was really interested in, and I went to. I can't remember the name of the. There was like a meeting that occurred that was like a. I think it was like the Homebrew Club or something like that. Anyways, Bill Atkinson um, presented a Rolodex card program, and it really fascinated me because I had been like thinking about that idea of content and containers and designing documents that had both pictures and text. And I think a lot of that came from my heavy interest of sketching and journaling. And I think I still have it. I still would like to see technology that enables you to work easily with text and image. But going back to what happened was I saw Bill's presentation of his Rolodex thing, and then I heard rumor that they were working on a color system, and so I was really interested in both. And there was a group there that was the instructional design group, and I was also interested in this whole usability issue of how do you inform users and how do you teach somebody to use a computer and so on. And so I had gotten a job at Apple in the instructional design group. Um, and so I worked on several projects there, including the first CD-ROM to ever ship out with a product, which was the Explorer disk. And so there was a vast amount of work there. But at the same time, Bill was working on HyperCard, and I was just really fascinated by a drawing text tool that you could use on screen to create content and information. And the idea of having active linking, that you push a button and it takes you to something else, and you can script and set that up. I was on the HyperCard team for a while there, but that was what drew my interest, was like there was this future color development and also this like program that I saw as being like, wow, that's so much closer to what I want to work on as a machine. And I think at Atari there wasn't. I don't think there was the interest business wise to try to develop applications and to extend the system. It was sort of like I mean, I think the attitude was sort of like, well, we've shown some examples and there's developers out there doing things. We're kind of done. Um, and I felt like they did not promote the stuff that had been done. Like Star Raiders never had any real promotion to it, I don't think. And even the Paint program. Um, well, one of the things that was frustrating to me was for the Paint program, they printed a black and white manual for the Paint program, and I felt like wow, here's the first color drawing program on screen, and it's, and
Should
you're
have
showing
a
them.
slick glossy color manual and
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to see something simple, but, so, so I think it was that sort of lack of, things moving forward that kind of got me interested. And I've had that pursuit and interest about, I've always liked being engaged with what technology is doing now, where's it going, what's it going to become, what sort of impact is it going to have, and the combination and the synergy between text and animation and drawing, and how do you combine all the visual elements of different types. I still think it's disappointing that there still isn't a program that's as simple to use as HyperCard was, and to be able to develop content. I mean,
yeah.
the web itself is kind of it's a pseudo HyperCard, but it's very difficult environment to develop in, and it just seems like development tools have always been the bane of technology, because there's no real money to be made in them, and so most places won't spend the effort, or if they do spend the effort, it's only to develop their own product, um, and so the same is true of debugging tools and drawing tools and layout type tools, is that there's just not it I feel like that's what holds technology back a lot, is that, nobody, like, you should be able to develop any kind of a web page just by cutting and pasting and putting stuff together,
Mm-hmm.
and that's gone almost in the opposite direction now. Now it's turned into this complete coding thing that's very complex and very convoluted, and, so, anyhow, that's just some of my thoughts about the technology, and what I felt that we were working on in
Mm-hmm.
those early days to move in a certain direction, but that direction, of course, changed as other machines, as other things came in.
Sure.
Um,
What do you do
so
today?
I'm doing consulting work, and I work particularly with startups. I had spent some time just recently working with a startup called Cloud On, and they were developing essentially document access on the iPad and on the Android and on the phones, for being able to view and create document and contents similar to Office, and using the XML open standards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the company was bought up by Dropbox, and um, so they've kind of disappeared. But right now I'm consulting with several other startup things, and I'm really interested in the kind of the startup arena, and particularly um, consulting to, like, what creates a product of value to continue to develop. Um, it's kind of it's a tough thing, and it's hard now because most of the big players are, like Apple and Google and Facebook and so on. They're so huge that they they have startups within them, and so I don't. The startup world has kind of shifted into, can you, how soon will your company be bought up if you do this idea,
Yeah.
and I kind of liked it when it was more of a, how could you start a new business, how could you do something that could turn into something else, but I think that'll change over time, and of course there is a lot going on. I'm impressed by the amount of just projects and people and startups, and the engagement into technology now is just so, um, it's permeates everything, and it was interesting to start in it in the days when people would say, oh, computers are just a fad. They'll be gone like 8-tracks in a few years. And, there was a lot of that, like, oh, well, this doesn't really do anything, so why would I buy it, kind of thing. And now it's turned into like, I can't live without having my phone.
Yeah.
Can't leave the house. So I think that shift has been interesting to watch, and to see. Also, the job specialization thing, I think, is kind of interesting because when I started, it was just if you were interested in technology, you just figured out what you could do to make something happen. There wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a user research specialist for, a particular category of something. So that's been kind of interesting to also see how the diversity in the industry has changed. But in some ways, I feel like that holds back the industry, that when people get into job roles that become so specific, it loses the opportunity to invent something or to have a role that's doesn't fit one of those descriptions, that is kind of a cross between, audio and visual and other types of development. So, which is why the startup community is so interesting to me. So, and I going back to I am trying to figure out how to deal with my archive of material, because I have stuff from Atari and Apple and Sega and, a lot of stuff I've kept just because I kind of felt that historically it had value. And so now I'm trying to make sure that does get scanned and placed somewhere and, kind of becomes available.
Thank you for doing that. I mean, again, if I can help, I don't want to oversell it, but if I can help, I will happy to. I've scanned thousands of pages of Atari material. And anyway, and there's a bunch of museums that'll happily take that stuff, but then it'll be in a file cabinet somewhere. And my goal is always to let's get it scanned and on the Internet Archive first, and then send it off to your museum or whatever, and then they'll have
right. And mine has been, I kind of want to keep the collection a little bit together before I disperse it in that, but it is tough because I have some stuff that's like printed and some stuff that's on diskettes and screenshots and Polaroids, and it covers a magnitude of different material. So, but we can talk more about that and about
Cool.
Scanning things. And I also have stuff that I can give you access to, the stuff that I do have scanned.
Awesome.
You can kind of see that. So, but yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So
thank you so much. I think I have about what I need.
Okay, good. If you need more, feel free to contact me.
I feel like we could talk for hours, but I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, me neither. I need to move on to some other things. So
great. Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah. I hope I answered some of those things. I can look at other stuff. If there's follow-up questions or something that we talked about that I sort of didn't remember off the top of my head, feel free to contact, let me know, and I can find something.
Great.
So, okay.
All right.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.